Most people don't know this. With 18.9 million barrels per day, America produces more oil than any other country in the world. Yes, US produces more oil than Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, UAE, or any other nation on earth. Now let me ask you a question. If Uncle Sam produces more oil than anyone else, why is the US involved in so many wars in oil-rich nations to have access to their oil? For example, on January 23, 1980, the American President Jimmy Carter, during his State of the Union address, said, quote, "Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force." Listening to Uncle Carter, you might think that Persian Gulf is one of the 50 states of the United States. But no, the Persian Gulf is this oil-rich region, 10,000 kilometers away from the US, which includes Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Iraq, Qatar, and Oman. So why was the US president threatening that nobody must go close to this region? Could it be because they have good soil America needed to plant sweet potatoes? No. Could it be because they have good weather the US president and his cabinet members needed for a vacation? No. Could it be because they have... See, I think I have to stop asking stupid questions. All the countries in this region have 4 things. Just 4 things. Deserts, sandstorm, mountains, and oil. We know oil is what President Carter referred to as the US vital interest because after decades of war and coups in several oil-rich countries, many American former generals, people like General Wesley Clark, General Anthony Zinni, General John Abizad, General Barry McCaffrey, and many more have now publicly confessed that the reason for American wars in oil-rich nations is, no surprise, oil. Now, if America is the largest oil producer in the world and Forbes magazine even estimated that the US exports 4 million barrels of oil per day, why does US start wars to have access to other people's oil? Believe me, this story is extremely interesting and it starts now.
President Donald Trump bringing back a familiar message from his campaign, talking about what he would have done in Iraq. Listen.
You brought up Iraq and something you said that could affect American troops in recent days. You said, we should have kept the oil, but okay, maybe we'll have another chance. What did you mean by that?
Well, we should have kept the oil when we got out. And you know, it's very interesting. Had we taken the oil, you wouldn't have ISIS. Because they fuel themselves with the oil. That's where they got the money.
So you believe we can go in and take the oil?
We should have taken the oil.
In his year 2000 book, Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation, Joseph J. Ellis wrote, "The Founding Fathers were not only revolutionaries, but also imperialists." In the same book, he wrote, "The American Revolution was not simply a war for independence, it was also a war for empire." We are coming back to this reference soon in the video. For now, let's use a simple story to explain why the US started wars to get more oil despite having a lot of oil. On March 20, 1602, the Dutch Empire, under the leadership of Maurice of Nassau, granted a charter to a Dutch company known as Verenigde Oost-Indische Company. If this name doesn't make sense to you, don't worry, it doesn't make sense to me either. So to make life easy for you and me, most importantly to prevent my teeth from falling out, we will refer to this company as VOC for the rest of this video. One of the purposes of VOC was to find spices for the most powerful empire of the early 17th century, the Dutch Empire. You see, just as the US dominates the world's economy today, the Dutch were the 17th century dominant player in the global economy. Just as the US had the most competent military, the Dutch with its superior navy was the king of the sea. And just as America is honest, truthful, and never kills anyone because of oil, the Dutch were good people who never killed anyone. Well, except if you had spices in your country. Then, I don't know. In 1603, the VOC commissioned their first fleet led by Admiral Stephen van der Hagen. The duty of this fleet was to go to every corner of the world, find people that have spices and politely shoot them in the head so that they can politely give their spices to the Dutch as they are politely going to heaven. The Dutch took over part of Indonesia's spices in 1603 and gradually conquered other territories that had spices. By the middle of the century, the earlier mentioned Prince of Orange, Maurice of Nassau, had died, and his half-brother, Frederick Henry, now sat on a throne that had either colonized, established trading posts with, or taken over spices territories of Taiwan, Sri Lanka, South Africa, India, Iran, Mauritius, Japan, and a part of the US, New York. Now, let's start making sense of this story by asking a question. What's so special about spices that made the Dutch kill people because of it? Why was the most powerful empire looking for this, and this? Well, that was because all of these were the oil of the 17th century. Spices were the keys to the 17th century global economy, just as oil is the key to our 21st century economy. Spices such as nutmeg, cloves, pepper, cinnamon, and ginger were the most valuable commodities in this era. But why? Well, these items were used as flavors, medicine, and even currency. Since refrigerators were not invented until the 20th century, spices were the refrigerators for hundreds of years. I mean, they were not the refrigerators literally, but spices were used to preserve food. Because of their scarcity, spices were very expensive. For example, 1 pound of nutmeg sold for the equivalent of $2,000 in today's currency. Needless to say, the Dutch, being the most powerful empire in the early 17th century, were willing to do anything just to be in control of the most valuable commodity of their time, spices. But this was not a strategy invented by the Dutch. For thousands of years, it has been the primary strategy of the most powerful empires to control the most valuable commodities of their era, oftentimes by, you get it, force. For example, the Roman Empire dominated and controlled the world's grain supply, particularly wheat, because that was the oil between the 1st century BC and 5th century AD. In his 77 AD book, Natural History, Roman warrior and war historian Pliny the Elder wrote, "The Roman Empire was maintained by the tributes of the provinces. The Spanish Empire controlled silver mines, and silver production because silver was the de facto currency in international trade in the 16th century. The Ottoman Empire controlled silk. The Portuguese Empire controlled salt. The Mongol Empire controlled livestock. The British Empire controlled the production and supply of tea and later cotton." Now, let's go back to the references we used at the beginning of this section. In his book, Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation, Joseph J. Ellis wrote, "The Founding Fathers were not only revolutionaries, but also imperialists." In the same book, he wrote, "The American Revolution was not simply a war for independence, it was also a war for empire." In other words, imperialism is deeply in the DNA of the United States. So, after World War II, when the United States emerged as the new superpower, what were you expecting? Well, it was not a question of whether or not the US would do what every empire before it did, that's control the most valuable resource of their era. It was a question of which resources the US would control and what other resources are as vital to the industrial world as oil. Now, I know you might be wondering, why does an empire need to control the production or supply of the most important commodity of its era? Well, that's because to become a superpower, you need to check 3 boxes. First, you need to create the biggest and most diversified economy. Second, you need to have the most powerful military in the world. And third, well, don't let me waste your time. There's really no third. Usually, if you have this and this, you can get every other thing you need either with a negotiation or with weapons. However, for you to have these 2 things, you need to be in control of the global economy. And how can you control the global economy if you don't control the essential commodity that powers it, which is oil in our era? Oil is the blood of the modern economy. Oil is the invisible force behind our industry, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, transportation of many kinds, electricity, global trades, and military forces. To control the oil in our modern world is to hold the steering of a vehicle. If you hold the steering of a vehicle, you can determine the destination of everyone else in that vehicle, which is exactly what every empire wants to do. Now we need to answer another question. But how do you control the steering? Well, there are two ways to control the steering. The first is you can politely ask for the steering, and second, you can politely ask for the steering. If you don't think there are differences between these two words, it's because you didn't finish elementary school. On the beautiful day of love, February 14, 1945, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was on his way back from the Yalta Conference, met with the King of Saudi, King Abdulaziz, on board the USS Quincy, anchored in the Great Bitter Lake of the Suez Canal. This was the first time a king of Saudi Arabia would meet with the President of the United States, and while these two leaders spoke about many things from the future of the Middle East to their opinion about Zionism and probably a new bedroom position they were planning to try that night, being the Valentine's Day, the most important take-home from the meeting is the quid pro quo arrangement, which some historians have since referred to as oil for security. In this 1945 arrangement, the US would provide military protection and security to Saudi Arabia. In return, Saudi Arabia would ensure a stable and secure oil supply to the US. This is how to politely ask for the steering. Other times, you can forcefully take the steering since you have the best military in the world. Oil-rich countries like Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, Nigeria, Angola, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and Yemen have all experienced coups, conflicts, and civil wars that are traceable to the American empire. And trust me, I'm not the one making this claim. Do you remember the list of American former generals I gave you at the beginning of this video? Now let's hear what some of them have to say.
Why are we going to Iraq? Why are we sending more people to Iraq than we are to the Afghanistan-Pakistan area where we know Al-Qaeda is? It made no sense to me.
Well, I think that's just become so clear that I wonder why the American people haven't gotten onto it yet. Yesterday, or day before yesterday, the Iraq oil report made the projection that there's 100 billion barrels for sure, 200 billion probably, and at the outside 300 billion. That dwarfs Saudi Arabia. I know why Dick Cheney went to Iraq.
Wow. So you're saying that it didn't have to do with Al-Qaeda or bin Laden. Obviously they weren't there, and you guys knew they weren't there. It had to do with the oil.
That was the camouflage. That was to get the American people excited about going to war in Iraq again. The real reason for Iraq, and incidentally the reason we aren't coming home anytime soon, is the oil.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa.
I think if you study the history of American policy in the Middle East, You have to start with Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1945 when he met with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of the modern Saudi regime, and promised U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and the royal family in return for Saudi Arabian oil. This predated the existence of the State of Israel and is the fundamental basis of U.S. policy in the Middle East. It's the basis of the Carter Doctrine, which says the U.S. will use force to protect the flow of oil.
The reason we fought that war was not to uphold UN mandates. It was not to prove that the New World Order was going to be established well by George Herbert Walker Bush. It was to protect oil. The reason we put forces down in the desert early was to keep Saddam Hussein from turning right and going into Saudi Arabia. We knew if he did, his tanks would roll over the 82nd Airborne Division we'd put on the ground, but his tanks would be rolling over U.S. soldiers, and that would be casus belli for sure. So my eyes began to be opened even more in this pragmatic way as to why the United States was using force in the world these days. In this case, it was all about oil. Of course, that would come back again in 2003 when we reinvaded Iraq and threw out all kinds of aspersions for reasons to the contrary, but we still were going back to that.
Well, we should have kept the oil when we got out. And you know, it's very interesting. Had we taken the oil, you wouldn't have ISIS, because they fuel themselves with the oil. That's where they got the money.
So you believe we can go in and take the oil?
We should have taken the oil.
At this point in the video, I feel like someone would want to say to me, okay, now we know that the empires always want to control the most important commodity in their era, and America is doing just that with oil. But how does that make sense when the US is the largest producer of oil? Why would an empire still have a gluttonous desire for what it already has enough of? Well, first of all, empires never have enough of anything. For example, the Dutch would have had half of the spices in the world and they will still need more. The Portuguese would have had half of the salt in the world and they will still kill to get more. The British would have colonized the entire planet Earth and still they would hope to find more people to colonize, even if it meant searching on the moon, Mars, or inside the sun. So even though America has always had a lot of oil, America can't have enough because empires are like my wife. My wife always tells me, I have no clothes, despite using 4 out of our 5-bedroom house to store her clothes. It was so bad that last week, when my best friend visited our home, he had to sleep in the toilet. Because all our rooms were busy housing my wife's 3 million pieces of clothes. Only for my friend to wake up the next morning and find my wife nagging, complaining that I don't buy her enough clothes. Please, don't tell my wife that I lied about her on the internet, but you get the analogy. Empires never have enough of anything. Never. The second reason why the US needs to be in control of the global oil supply is that the US actually needs much more oil than it has. Let me explain. Being the biggest economy in the world, America consumes more than 19 million barrels of oil per day as of 2022. While this is very close to the quantity of oil the US produced during the same period, oils are like clothes. Yes, I'm using the analogy of clothes again. You see, not all clothes are the same. Some clothes are designed for night wear, some for business meetings, and some if you want to cheat on your wife with a girl living in the same street. In the same way, we have different kinds of oils: light sweet crude, heavy sour crude, petroleum coke, low sulfur diesel, jet fuel, special lubricating oil, vacuum gas oil, bunker fuel, petroleum coke, and probably a few more. Some of these oils are more abundant in countries like Iraq, Iran, or Nigeria, while others might be available in the US or Russia. This explains why America usually imports certain oils while exporting others. Another reason why the US needs oil from the rest of the world is that America really doesn't have an unlimited oil reserve. I know, nobody does, but you get what I mean. Take for example, the American oil production from 1925 looks like this. By the 1970s, the US was already either the #1 or #2 largest oil producer in the world. But then, after 1975, American oil production started declining. One of the reasons for this decline production is mature oil fields. How can I explain mature oil fields? Think of mature oil fields like clothes. No, I will not use the clothes analogy in this video again, I promise. In fact, we don't need any analogy. Just imagine we're drilling oil from this location. Since oil is a finite source, if you keep drilling oil in this particular location, you have to get to a point where there is less and less oil reserve here, so it's becoming much more difficult to drill, or the cost of drilling will be more expensive than the oil you're getting, hence lower oil production. Other things responsible for this drop are American complex geology, offshore drilling, depletion rates, and a few other factors. However, after 2010, the US oil production started improving again till 2018 when America became the largest producer, just as it was in the 1970s. This improved production is due to the breakthroughs in advanced technology which allow for more oil from the mature fields. Now imagine for a second that you're the president of the United States and you're aware that even though your country is one of the largest oil producers, you really don't have as much oil under the soil and your production can fluctuate like this. What are you going to do? Well, maybe you should use your tanks, warplanes, and CIA to secure as much oil from the rest of the world as possible. The third reason why the United States needs the world's oil is because of what former American President Dwight D. Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. In his 1532 book, The Prince, the Italian diplomat and political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli wrote, "A prince ought to have no other object nor any other thought than war and its discipline, for that is the sole art that is necessary to one who commands." This statement is also true of an empire. The primary job of an empire is to wage wars. But how do you effectively wage wars? When I was researching this video, I read two stories that are very important for this section. The first story is the story of the 19th century French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon became one of the greatest warriors in history by surprising his enemies with speed and mobility. But how did he get these two elements? Well, unlike many generals in his days, Napoleon and his men traveled with very little food, horses, and even sometimes little weapons. The strategy is to carry as few items as possible so you can travel fast. Then as you traveled from one country or city to another, you politely ask the strangers you meet on the road to give you their food, horses, or weapons, and if they don't give you, you politely send them a message to heaven. This strategy worked for Napoleon during the 1796 Battle of Castiglione against the Austrian, the 1805 Battle of Austerlitz against Russia and Austrian, the 1806 Battle of Jena against Prussian, and many other Napoleon's military campaigns. The second story we need to explain in this section is that of the Roman Empire. At its peak, the Roman Empire covered a whopping 5.9 million square kilometers of land across Europe, Asia, and Africa. During this same period, Rome had as many as 400,000 soldiers scattered all over this territory. Do you remember I told you earlier that the Romans controlled the supply of grain? One of the reasons why Romans sought to control the global grain supply was that the empire must feed its 400,000 soldiers every day. And how do you feed such most likely gluttonous heavyweight champions if you don't steal other people's grain? Now let's go back to the United States. Just like the Roman Empire, America today has its soldiers everywhere on the planet. According to this Al Jazeera report, the United States has more than 750 military bases in more than 80 countries all around the world. Some other sources put that number at 800, while some even claim that the number is close to 1,000. The purpose of having your gunpowder everywhere is so that you can crush anybody, anywhere, at any time, if the need be. And just as the Romans needed tons of wheat to feed their hundreds of thousands of soldiers, America needed tons of oil to keep its thousands of tanks, naval ships, and warplanes running every day. Now, remember the story I told you about Napoleon? It's the story of speed and mobility. For America, what that means is that even if the US has half of the world's oil on its territory, those oils are not useful for the 700 military bases across the globe. For example, the US military bases in Iran, South Africa, or Japan can't possibly depend on American fuel for their operations. So what's the way out? The US needs oil resources everywhere, and when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. Where? While preparing for this video, I decided not to talk about some things even though they were relevant to our discussion. One of those things is dollar recycling and dollar for oil, which meant that because most of the global oil producers sell oil in dollars, first, those transactions create demand for American currency, and second, these nations also invest their earnings in the United States, which then help the US economy and government to spend the money they don't have. I have some statistics and numbers about these American investments from oil-rich nations, but see, let me tell you the truth. This is the 6th day I've been working full-time researching and crafting this video. I'm already tired, so I will probably have to tell you about dollar recycling in a future video. Forgive my laziness, or stop watching the video. I started this video with a 1980 speech by the American President Jimmy Carter, in which the president threatened, most likely the Soviet Union, not to go close to this region. I showed and later used statements from former US generals confirming what everyone already knows, that the US involvement in conflicts and wars in oil-rich regions is about oil. But why? Considering the fact that both in the 1970s and today, the United States is one of the largest producers of oil, why does the US have to fight to get more oil? In this video, I explain 3 reasons. First, like every other superpower before it, America needs to control the global oil supply so it could use that control to help its economy and to kind of drive every other nation on earth to anywhere it chooses. Empires in history have always controlled essential products and produce in their era in order to exert influence, project power, and shape global economic systems. I gave the examples of the Dutch with spices, the Romans with grain, and others. The second reason why US needs the control of oil is because, well, America has the largest economy in the world, and that economy needs about 20 million barrels of oil per day. The US local oil supply is not always stable or predictable, hence, America needs every drop of oil it can get globally. The third reason why the US needs oil at every point or territory around the globe is that the US has military bases in more than 700 locations around the globe. Some of these locations are 10,000 or even 15,000 kilometers away from the US. I told you the story of Emperor Napoleon and that of the Roman Empire to explain the importance of speed and mobility in warfare, which means if American soldiers want to effectively operate everywhere on the globe, just like Napoleon, they must be able to get everything they need in those locations, either politely or politely. Thank you so much for watching our videos. If you like our videos, it's because it takes a lot of time